Okay, it's 12:30. I think we will make a start. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for another Beale Co webinar, the second webinar of our current construction winter webinar series. We're delighted to have so many attendees joining us today. My name is Buckby, and I am a partner at Beale Co and lead our contracts and project advisory team. I'm joined today by Ian Masser, also a partner at Beale Co. Ian specialises in construction disputes and has been instructed on a number of high-profile professional negligence fire safety matters, and will be passing on his experience and know-how during today's session. Today we have a large number of new attendees who do not usually attend our construction webinars. So if you don't mind, just a short introduction on Beale Co for those who don't know us. Beale Co is a specialist law firm in the field of international construction and insurance law. We have provided advice relating to complex projects and disputes around the world for over 50 years. We work with construction professionals, contractors, developers, investors, employers, and importantly, their insurers, providing a full project service. Beale Co now has over 100 lawyers spread across offices in the City of London, where I am today, Bristol, Dublin, and the United Arab Emirates. Please do visit our website or contact me or Ian should you require any further information. Our contact details are on the screen in front of you. Today's session will cover issues surrounding the Form EWS1, or the External Wall Fire Review Form. It will discuss the ongoing industry challenges surrounding external wall fire safety on buildings over 18 metres in height. I'm sure at this point every attendee of this webinar is well aware of the concerns over building fire safety in the UK, and obviously the tragedy that led to the current national discussion on this issue. Since Grenfell and the revelations of widely used combustible cladding, the supply chain and insurance market have faced increased pressures. We hope this session will help you navigate some of the salient issues. Today we'll start with a quick recap on some of the consequences of the Grenfell tragedy, focusing on the changes to the building regulations and Form EWS1. We will then look at the changes to the building regulations more closely and discuss some of the practical considerations that have arisen from those changes. Next, we will be discussing the risks associated with Form EWS1 and some alternative solutions where clients or funders are requesting use of the form. We will then consider other mitigating methods before concluding this session, and if time allows, taking some questions. If we don't have time to progress through the questions, we will deal with these after today's session by circulating a question and answer summary to all attendees. You can raise questions on the interactive taskbar down the side of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and we will circulate a copy of the slides afterwards, usually the first question we get asked. So I'm now going to hand you over to Ian, who's going to provide some more background to this very important topic.
Thanks there, Will. Yeah, good afternoon to everybody. As you will all be acutely aware, the plight of homeowners being unable to sell or remortgage their homes which are clad with materials deemed to be combustible has been in the news recently. It's fair to say the mainstream publicity has been overwhelmingly negative. For example, in September of this year, the BBC described the EWS1 form as, and I quote, red tape, and further reported that there were only 291 people who were qualified to provide EWS1 forms. but at the same time, they reported that there were some 2.8 million flats estimated to require a Form EWS1. Now, if that's correct, then each suitably qualified professional would have to certify circa 9,622 flats each on average. This would clearly be unworkable, even more so when you come to consider the risks inherent with signing EWS1 forms and the current PI insurance position that we will get to later on during this webinar. The Telegraph also reported in August of this year that the EWS1 form process had, and I quote again, created chaos, and described the situation for homeowners as being, and I quote again, a cladding nightmare. The lack of suitably qualified fire experts has also been identified and reported on by the Financial Times. The RICS has issued a recent warning to its members that there was a trend developing of unqualified people signing EWS1 forms. This trend has likely arisen as a result of these unqualified individuals spotting an opportunity to capitalise on the shortage of suitably qualified professionals willing to sign EWS1 forms. And finally, even the UN have had their say, warning the UK government that the failure to remove combustible cladding from high-rise buildings may be a contravention of the UK's obligations under international law. In the wake of the tragic fire at Grenfell Tower in June 2017, the use of combustible materials on construction projects has come under intense scrutiny. I think it was inevitable that there was going to be a public inquiry and that there would be changes to existing legislation concerning the design and construction of high-rise buildings. We've already had the Building Amendment Regulations 2018, which came into force on the 21st of December 2018, and the draft Building Safety Bill is another major piece of legislation that is on the horizon. The draft Building Safety Bill itself is the subject of our penultimate webinar of this series that is taking place on the 13th of January next year, so I won't discuss it in detail today. However, these legislative changes are going to have a wide-ranging impact on the construction industry and will affect all manner of issues from appetite to risk to training, competency, standards and industry best practice. The Building Amendment Regulations 2018 have also created a two-tier system, whereby on the one hand, you will have new buildings constructed after 21 December 18 that will have to comply with the 2018 regs. There ought to be absolute certainty that these buildings, when complete, will not contain any combustible materials whatsoever. However, on the other hand, there will also be buildings that were either completed long before 21 December 18 or buildings where the construction work had already started but not yet finished before 21 December 18. With buildings such as these, there will be potential uncertainty as to whether or not these buildings contain combustible materials, and where they do, whether such buildings are safe to reside in. And it's this very issue that has had such an impact on the housing market and which has led to the creation of the EWS1 form. It was also inevitable that there would be extensive litigation arising from the post-Grenfell fallout. As Will mentioned at the start, I'm currently involved in numerous cladding-related disputes, as are several of my colleagues. In response to pressures from the public and construction industry alike, the government appointed an independent expert panel to advise the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government on immediate building safety measures following the Grenfell Tower fire. The independent expert advisory panel has published a number of advice notes aimed at providing stakeholders with the information necessary to make reasoned and safe decisions regarding buildings that contain combustible materials. Some of these guidance notes are set out on the slides, but also includes a statement setting out the panel's response on the adequacy of BS 8414 tests, periodic advice to building owners, landlords and leaseholders where ACM cladding is present on their building, including advice in relation to the 3 large-scale wall tests undertaken by the BRE which looked at 3 different types of ACM cladding combined with different types of insulation in accordance with BS 8414. Remediation of non-ACM buildings, including high-pressure laminate panels, and information relating to the Building Safety Fund for the remediation of unsafe non-ACM cladding systems. Guidance issued to building owners and occupiers relating to the government's investigation into the fire door industry, and a response re sprinklers and other fire safety measures in new high-rise blocks of flats following a consultation process. In addition, in May 2017, the Hackett report was released, and this was commissioned by the government following the Grenfell Tower fire, and has provided recommendations on the future regulatory system in this area. It is the recommendations from this report that is the main driver behind the draft building safety bill that is currently making its way through Parliament. And so finally, phase 2 of the public inquiry, as we all know, into the fire is currently underway, following the publication of the phase 1 report in October 2019. The government's efforts to increase safety in this area have culminated in the introduction of the Building Amendment Regulations 2018. The 2018 regs make a number of amendments to the Building Regulations 2010 and to approved Document B, which covers fire safety matters within and around buildings. Entering into force on the 21st of December 18, the 2018 regs introduce a ban on the use of combustible materials on the exterior walls of new buildings that are over 18 metres in height. Now, combustible materials are those which do not achieve a European or British classification of either A2S1, D0 or A1 in accordance with BS 13501. The ban does not apply to materials which do achieve these classification or ratings. And the government has also clarified that this also includes materials deemed by European Commission decisions to meet these requirements. The main sort of section I think to sort of focus on from the 2018 regs reads as follows, and it basically deals with buildings that are impacted by those regulations are buildings with a storey not including rooftop plant areas or any storey consisting exclusively of plant rooms, at least 18 metres above ground level, and which contains one or more dwellings, an institution, or a room for residential purposes, excluding any room in a hostel, hotel, or boarding house. Therefore, the regulations affect new buildings such as apartments, hospitals, and student accommodation. Whilst the 2018 regulations do not have retrospective effect, so therefore will not apply to existing residential buildings over 18 metres in height, they will apply where there is a material change of use to an existing building, which results in the building becoming such that it is within those governed by the 2018 regs. In such circumstances, the building will be subject to an investigation, and when necessary, remedial work must be carried out to ensure compliance with the 2018 regs. In practice, failing to achieve the required standards could result in lengthy and expensive delays to a project, as all non-compliant materials, whether used accidentally or otherwise, will need to be removed from the building in their entirety where identified. In addition, it is important to note that the 2018 regs apply to materials used on both the external walls of a building and certain specified attachments to the external walls. Now, these attachments could include solar panels, balconies, and sun shading. Consideration should also be given to other items such as built-in LED screens or signage, which may form part of the external walls of a building and therefore could require compliance with the 2018 regs. And finally, the introduction of the 2018 regs has also introduced an interesting legal debate from a contentious disputes point of view. The issue is regarding the scope of remedial works that a claimant is entitled to implement, and I will touch on this in more detail later. Now, following the Grenfell Tower tragedy, the building research establishments, on behalf of the Department for Communities and Local Government, tested the core fillers of a variety of different ACM panels to check their combustibility. If these tests demonstrated that the core's filler was of limited combustibility, it received a Category 1 rating, whereby a Category 2 or 3 rating was given to ACM panels where the core's filler was deemed not to be of limited combustibility. And subsequently, the Independent Expert Advisory Panel felt that the BRE should undertake further tests to establish how different types of ACM cladding behaved in a fire in combination with different types of insulation. These tests looked at 6 combinations of 3 different types of ACM cladding. The first of these test results was published in July 17 and were generally completed by September 17. Now, it was from this point onwards that I certainly started to see cladding claims being particularised in inter-solicitor pre-action correspondence. And what I have typically seen is the following materials being the subject matter of cladding-related disputes. Firstly, you've got ACM panels with polyethylene cores. And the reason for this primarily is because the government's independent experts advisory panel concluded that ACM cladding with unmodified polyethylene core fillers, i.e. Category 3 products, presents a significant fire hazard on residential buildings at any height with any form of insulation. The second sort of material that I'm seeing is non-FR grade high pressure laminate, for example, Trespa Meteon high pressure laminate panels. And again, the main reason for this and the focus on HPL panels is because the government's independent expert advisory panel concluded that there needed to be immediate action taken to remediate unsafe HPL systems. And they sort of concluded by saying, for the avoidance of doubt, both the removal of unsafe ACM Category 3 panels and action to remediate unsafe HPL systems should be carried out as soon as possible. The third product that I'm sort of seeing coming up all the time in relation to sort of cladding related disputes is Kingspan K15 insulation. And what I'm seeing from the claimant side of things is claimants citing that K15 is not of limited combustibility because its rating is CS1D0 according to the BBA 2015 certificate, and therefore it does not meet the requirements of approved document B. And as I'm sure sort of people have seen, this product has come under intense scrutiny this week in the Phase 2 Grenfell inquiry. The fourth issue that comes up all the time, it concerns vertical and horizontal cavity barriers. And I can say sort of hand on heart that on every single cladding claim that I'm involved in, the claimant sort of experts have identified issues with the design and or installation of cavity barriers whilst opening up the building in question. Looking ahead to the future, I also sort of anticipate that we may start to see more claims relating to PIR and phenolic foams, other metal composite material cladding, which contains an unmodified Category 3 polyethylene filler, expanded polystyrene insulation, and render and timber wall systems. Sort of on the sort of flip side of that, we've seen the following sort of products and materials being sort of recommended by claimant, fire engineering, and architectural experts as part of any sort of proposed remediation works that have been put forward on projects that have become litigious post Grenfell. And I think that there are sort of two sort of caveats listed on the slides, but it's just important to sort of emphasise those again. First, the list is not exhaustive, and what I'm about to say, and secondly, the use of such products materials would still always need to be checked on each individual project by the design team involved to ensure overall suitability for that project in question and overall compliance with the regs. But the first product I've sort of seen that's been put forward is Vitradual 3mm thick A1 rated panels, and we've had various sort of manufacturers' comments that have been provided to us either through sort of experts exchanges or through into solicitor correspondence. But the things that stand out to me is that Vitra dual aluminium cladding is listed as being A1 rated, non-combustible, and a high impact resistant solid panel. And I think the manufacturers marketed as being one of the few large format cladding panels that is truly 100% non-combustible and achieving an A1 rating to BS13501. It also has apparently been tested to BS8414 for fire performance of external cladding systems and is compliant to the BR135 requirements. Second product that I've sort of seen being sort of put forward frequently is Rockwool rain screen Geo Slab A1 rated insulation. And this has sort of been put forward again with sort of manufacturers' comments being provided to me along the lines of it being a thermally efficient non-combustible insulation. And it's A1 non-combustible rated, BRE tested and BBA approved. Third product is Rock Panel FS Extra with an A2 S1D0 rating. And the fourth is Fundamax M-Look exterior grade, which again has an A2 S1D0 rating. This one again is basically with manufacturers' comments saying that it is suitable and has achieved a classification A2 S1D0 according to BS13501. Final sort of bit from me before I hand over to Will. I've already mentioned the point earlier that the 2018 regs have created this two-tier system, whereby, say, on the one hand, you have new buildings constructed after 21 December 18 that ought not to contain any combustible materials whatsoever. And on the other hand, you've got buildings that were either completed before 21 December 18 or buildings where the construction work had started but not finished before 21/18, where there will be potential uncertainty as to whether or not these buildings contain combustible materials. In respect of claims concerning cladding, and certainly in respect of the claims that I am currently handling for various clients, I am seeing the following sort of main categories of allegations being made. Firstly, sort of breach of contractual and/or tortious reasonable skill and care obligations in relation to either the specification of combustible materials, the production of a design that's utilised combustible materials, and/or supervision, inspection, monitoring and/or certification of workmanship that did not comply with the applicable building regs. The second sort of big issue that I see is issues relating to breach of contractual strict liability obligations because the final delivered building does not comply with the applicable building regs. And finally, breach of statutory duties owed under the Defective Premises Act 1972 because the building in question is deemed to be not fit for human habitation. Now, given that these claims are ongoing matters, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to sort of publicly discuss them in significant detail. However, I do feel I'm able to identify some sort of common issues that not only myself, but other litigation practitioners that I've spoken to are seeing, both on the claimant and defendant side of the fence in relation to these cladding claims. The first sort of point is the key issue is demonstrating compliance with the applicable regs in force at the time the work in question was undertaken. Now, from an evidential point of view, that often means having to undertake a retrospective BS 8414 test. Now, I've encountered two sort of main issues with this. Firstly, 8414 tests must be conducted at a UK Accreditation Service accredited test centre. And given the large number of high-rise buildings that have been identified as possibly containing combustible material, there has been considerable backlogs at these centres. Now, I'm starting to see this easing, but at the same time, you can still be looking at several months from a lead-in time point of view. Second issue that I'm sort of seeing is that a BS 8414 test requires you to test the exact as-built installed system. Now, this is less of an issue if you are able to remove as-installed materials from site to assist you when constructing your testing rig. But if you can't do that, it can sometimes be difficult to source identical products given the passage of time that has often elapsed since practical completion of the project in question. And the introduction of BS 9414 needs to be considered if you're thinking of substituting materials. Third issue I'm seeing is that claimants and sort of building owners, or those responsible for the building in question, are often making a claim not only to the contractor or design team involved in the original project works, but also to the NHBC under applicable build mark policies. Now, if the NHBC accepts that claim made under the build mark policy, it can cause issues regarding who the actual claimant is and how the claim will ultimately be progressed. Next sort of point is the condition attached to the government's remediation funding for the removal and replacement of both ACM and non-ACM cladding has meant that more claims are being pursued at a preliminary stage. And finally, one of the biggest issues I've encountered concerns quantum and the scope of remedial works that a claimant is entitled to implement. Now, I touched on this issue earlier, and whilst the 2018 regs are clear that they do not have retrospective effect, I have seen numerous claimants assert that they are implementing a remedial scheme that is compliant with the 2018 regs, regardless of the fact that, for example, the building contract in question was subject to, say, the 2010 regs. Now, the arguments that the claimants are putting forward is that the original cladding has to be removed as it is non-compliant with, say, for example, the 2010 building regs. And they say that they've obtained independent expert evidence in support of such a position. The argument then develops to say basically that they're now in a position where they have to remediate the building, and they are required to ensure that what they put back on the building is compliant with the new 2018 regs, which, as we discussed earlier, means that the building cannot contain any combustible material whatsoever. And this often leads to a situation where claimants are intending to remediate their buildings with arguably superior products and materials than they would have ended up with under the original building contract. Now, sort of certain parties on the receiving end of such an argument often feel very strongly that it amounts to betterment, and this issue has not yet been brought before a court, but it's an issue that I think would benefit from judicial determination sort of sooner rather than later, because it comes up pretty much all of the time. In respect of EWS1 forms, I have not seen any professional negligence claims yet regarding completion of the same, but I suspect they will come. Will and I have been involved in assisting clients who have been asked to sign EWS1 forms, both in circumstances where they were and were not involved in the original works. And will discuss this in more detail shortly.
Thanks, Ian. Excuse me. As Ian has set out, the Grenfell tragedy led to a considerable push for change within the industry, including in respect of the building regs. Amongst other things, what was deemed acceptable by the industry before Grenfell in relation to the selection and specification of certain materials may now not be the case. Against this backdrop, as Ian has pointed out, many building, flat and apartment owners have been unable to sell their property because mortgage lenders have refused to lend until confirmation is obtained that the building has been tested and complies with industry requirements, the current industry requirements. And it's this that has led to the introduction of Form EWS1. Now, following what seems to have been limited consultation, RICS, the Building Societies Association and UK Finance agreed between themselves an industry-wide process to be used by valuers, lenders, building owners and fire safety experts in the valuation of high-rise properties. This process is in essence Form EWS1. The form is intended to record a consistent and universal manner as to what assessments have been carried out on the external wall construction of residential apartment buildings. Its aim is to replace the numerous liability letters created by the various mortgage lender members of these organisations, which began to appear around the summer of 2019. Form EWS1 requires a fire safety assessment to be conducted by a suitably qualified and competent professional, and the building's fire safety is then confirmed formally using Form EWS1. The Council of Mortgage Lenders website provides that Form EWS1 delivers assurance for lenders, valuers, residents, buyers and sellers. So a positive comment. Now, that may be the case, but the form contains significant risks for the consultant, including professional indemnity insurance implications, which seem to be ignored in the development of this form before its introduction to the industry. I think it's fair to say that large parts of the construction sector and their insurers have significant concerns with Form EWS1, particularly from the perspective of the consultant who's required to sign it. I think this is demonstrated by the large number of attendees we have joining us today. Now, our frank advice to the consultants being asked to sign this form is to avoid it. And if similar confirmation is still required, to use an alternative. Ian, I just touch upon the current state of play in the PI market, and also importantly the PI market's view on the form and how the market's reacting.
Yep, thanks, Will. The UK and indeed the global PI market hardened significantly in 2019 and remains hard today. It's no secret that the current hard PI market has made things challenging for contractors and construction professionals alike. Not only is PI insurance an essential part of a business's risk management process, it is often required to be demonstrated when bidding for new work. Furthermore, having PI insurance in place at a certain level during the project phases itself, and then maintaining that PI insurance for a set period of time post completion of the works, is usually a contractual requirement on any successful contractor or construction professional. And I know Will's team has advised numerous clients on what to do when they found themselves in a situation where they've been unable to comply with these contractual requirements. It's also been a challenging time for insurers as well, who have been left to bear a significant proportion of the financial bill for remedying non-compliant cladding and insulation, following the legislative changes that have arisen post-Grenfell. This situation has undoubtedly caused insurers to adjust their appetite for risks in relation to cladding and general fire safety matters, and the widespread exclusions that have appeared in policy wordings is testament to that. It's important to recognise, though, that the current hard PI market has not been caused solely by these cladding matters that have occurred post-Grenfell. There were and are other factors in play. For example, insurers have adjusted their appetite for risk generally, i.e. not just in relation to cladding and general fire safety matters. There has been a reduction in PI market capacity, which has seen 12 carriers withdraw from the Lloyd's market altogether, following Lloyd's July 2018 review. And there's also been well-known company market insurers who have withdrawn or reduced their PI capacity as well. And to give you an idea of the scale of this point, I have read that the London market has lost circa $150 million of professional liability capacity over the last 2 years. There's also been considerable organic growth from some groups of insureds in 2019, which has further depleted an already reduced insurance capacity. And sort of finally, we've had the current COVID-19 induced recession that has exacerbated the other PI market challenges that have arisen post-Grenfell. Now, if we all wind the clock back a year, we were all talking about 2020 being a year of growth, and as we all know, it hasn't quite worked out like that. Instead, we sort of found ourselves working at home for the majority of the year, and we found ourselves in an intense recession. And this has caused some nervousness amongst underwriters who remember the 2008 global financial crash and the impact that that had on construction risks, where, for example, what we were seeing sort of, you know, at the time of the 2008 global financial crash was onerous contractual provisions being more readily accepted or agreed by contractors and or design professionals, sort of lower margin work being undertaken, and contractors and design professionals sort of beginning work in sectors where they traditionally did not have experience in. And the current hard market has therefore resulted in the following for prospective insureds. We've seen sort of firstly a sort of a continued increase in pricing and rates, and that trend sort of gained momentum in 2019, continued into this year, and looks set to continue into 2021. It's also, whilst it's still possible to purchase large limits of indemnity, sort of seeing that for you know, the companies that require it, new excess layers are becoming more challenging, and quoted prices are reflecting that. We're seeing increased sort of excesses and deductibles continuing, but they do now at least appear to be becoming more sector focused moving into 2021. Insurers are still looking in the main to review aggregation and focusing on reducing exposure to single insured by cutting line sizes. And on the whole, sort of what I'm sort of seeing is renewal books being sort of the main focus for most insurers. We're still seeing the sort of the widespread exclusion wording relating to cladding and general fire safety matters. However, I've sort of seen several instances where insurers have moved from sort of blanket exclusions to now offering separate commercial terms for additional cover. In relation to EWS1 forms, I'm aware that some insurers are declining to provide cover for completion of such forms unless the reviewer was involved in the original project. And as will come on to explain, this is because correctly identifying the fire safety position can be difficult without extensive opening up and for fear of costly negligence claims in the event that the position certified is subsequently shown to be incorrect. I'm also aware that some insurers have tightened their position recently on EWS1 forms as part of the recent renewals process that's sort of taken place, with some providing cover for EWS1 forms completed before the 1st of December, but declining cover for any EWS1 forms completed after this date. And just sort of a final point to end on, it's hoped, and I stress the word hoped, that the draft's building summary bill may assist with returning some confidence to underwriters, given that one of the main drivers in the draft legislation is raising industry-wide competencies. However, this remains to be seen. Just sort of also finally, just to sort of cover this point in relation to insurance, I'm sure you all will have seen, on the 21st of November of this year, the government provided an update in relation to EWS1 forms generally. I'm going to come on to discuss this in more detail later, but one issue that they did report on was that the government is working apparently with the insurance industry to ensure professional indemnity insurance is available for assessors. And sort of when I read this, I thought to myself, okay, whilst the intention of trying to work closer with the professional indemnity insurance market is undoubtedly a step in the right direction, no concrete solutions have been put forward, as far as I can tell, as to how professional indemnity insurance is going to be made more readily available for assessors. So it's one thing to say it, but how do you actually start to deliver on it and make it sort of become a reality? And as I said earlier, judging by how PI insurers appear to be reacting to the EWS1 forms as part of the current renewals process, it doesn't seem like a solution is close to being found either. But again, we just have to see. Anyway, I'm now going to hand back to Will to continue his analysis of the form EWS1.
Thanks, Ian. So yeah, now back to form EWS1 itself. And I suppose why the form is causing so much alarm amongst the industry, amongst insurers. And I'm afraid to say I don't have much good things to say about it. The objective of the form is made clear in the first paragraph on EWS1. The form is intended for recording in a consistent manner what assessment has been carried out for the external wall construction of residential apartment buildings where the highest floor is 18 meters or more above ground level, or where specific concerns exist. Form EWS1 confirms that the consultant exercising reasonable skill and care, and we always like to see these words, has investigated the primary external wall materials and attachments of the external walls of the relevant building or block. So straight away, construction lawyers advising consultants considering this form will have real concerns with this confirmation. In particular, as a result of the investigations required of the consultant, the form increases the likelihood of the consultant being jointly and severally liable with the contractor in respect of the works, if there are, say, issues with the external walls of the building. The form doesn't distinguish between matters of design and matters of pure workmanship. If the consultant confirms that the external wall materials are fine, but they are not, the beneficiary of the form would be entitled to pursue the consultant for losses relating to say, the remedial works. The consultant, at the very least, is likely to owe the recipient, the beneficiary of the form, a common law duty of care to ensure that the form is completed accurately. Note 5 on Form EWS1 states that the investigations would often include either a physical inspection, inspection of photographic evidence, inspection of the standards of construction, or a review of design drawings. Now, this raises a number of concerns. Firstly, if the consultant has not been required to carry out any of these tasks as part of its appointment, it shouldn't sign the form, as this will ultimately extend the consultant's scope, the consultant's liability, beyond that of their original appointment on the project. Secondly, Form EWS1 doesn't state what the extent of any investigations were or when the investigations took place. The drafting suggests, and this isn't clear, that it is for the consultant to decide using reasonable skill and care. So again, the drafting in Form EWS1 may require the consultant to do more than it has agreed to provide under its appointment. For example, if the circumstances would have required the consultant exercising reasonable skill and care to undertake a detailed investigation, such as opening up of the external wall, the consultant should have done so. Perhaps more worrying is that the form does not state precisely the investigation which the consultant carried out. Such a proper statement as to the extent of any investigation would certainly reduce the chance of the consultant giving any inaccurate confirmation and therefore being negligent. If only a cursory or visual inspection took place and an intrusive investigation was not possible, the drafting should certainly state this. This type of wording is in commonplace in other bespoke compliance letters. Leaving it open-ended or unclear, I think more than suggests that the consultant could have carried out a detailed inspection, whether or not it has in the circumstances. Thirdly, my view is that the form may not just be requiring a cursory check of the building's exterior. Note 5 makes clear, by referring to the inspection of the construction carried out by the contractor, that there is more than just inspecting, carrying out a cursory check of the building's exterior. And what is clear is that the consultant cannot just rely on the relevant as-built record drawings for the whole building. You know, that would be nice, but these are not expressly enshrined within Form EWS1. The statements that the consultant is required to make when completing Form EWS1 are also a concern, and sorry, some more negative points. When assessing buildings, the signatory of the form has two options to select. Option A for buildings where the materials used in the external wall would be unlikely to support combustion, or option B where combustible materials are present in the external wall. The guidance notes as shown on this slide provide that for option A, only those with expertise to identify the relevant materials within the external wall and attachments and whether fire resisting cavity barriers have been installed correctly should sign the form. This, it states, should be a member of a relevant professional body, which is hugely vague. For option B, the signatory would need expertise in the assessment of the fire risk presented by external wall materials. The drafting is a bit clearer here, as it provides that this should be a member of the relevant professional body that deals with fire safety in the built environment. And this could be a chartered engineer with Institution of Fire Engineers or equivalent. So the important message is, consultants, if you do not have this expertise, do not sign the form. And architects in particular, you should only sign this form if you feel professionally that you are able to. I'm now going to provide a bit more information on option A. So if option A is selected, the consultant confirms that the primary materials used in the construction of the external walls, and I quote, meet the criteria of limited combustibility or better, and cavity barriers are installed to an appropriate standard in the relevant locations. Additionally, the consultant will also need to select one of A1, A2, or A3 in relation to the attachments to the external wall build-up. Option A1 requires a consultant to confirm that there are no attachments whose construction includes significant quantities of combustible materials. Option 2 provides confirmation that an appropriate risk assessment of the attachments has been completed and confirms that no remedial works are required. And if option 3 is selected, the consultant is saying that option A1 and option A2 do not apply, and there may be potential costs of remedial works to the attachments. So what does this mean? What are the risks? The risk for the consultant in respect of option A, and as I've mentioned, is if the consultant provides confirmation that the external walls meet the criteria of limited combustibility or better, and that cavity barriers are installed to an appropriate standard in the relevant locations, and this turns out to be incorrect, it's likely to result in the consultant being jointly and severally liable with the contractor. This is clear with option A1 and option A2, and the confirmation required here is self-explanatory. But option A3 is of a real concern. If selected, it states that where options A1 or A2 do not apply, there may be potential costs of remedial works to the attachments. Now, the concern here is that if the consultant has been responsible for the design or other services relating to the relevant external wall, or has a monitoring, checking, or an inspection role, selecting option A3 may result in the consultant walking into a professional indemnity insurance claim, potentially omitting liability depending on the appointment and the relevant circumstances. So this is a further reason why we at Beale Co, and me in particular, do not like Form EWS1. As noted earlier, option B is used where there is combustible materials present in the external wall. The consultant will be required to, and I quote, use the reasonable skill and care that would be expected of the relevant professional advisor to assess the level of fire risk presented by the external wall construction and attachments. The consultant will need to choose between options B1 and B2, which are on the slide in front of you. B1 concludes that the fire risk is sufficiently low, that no remedial works are required, whilst B2 concludes that an adequate standard of safety is not achieved, and also refers to identifying to the client organisation the remedial and interim measures required. Note 9 of Form EWS1 provides guidance as to the extent of the assessment required. Now, first starting with note 9, this provides a reasonable amount of detail in relation to that assessment. It states, and again I quote, that the assessment of fire risk as described above includes that insofar as is necessary to ensure a reasonable standard of health and safety to those in and around the building, all external wall constructions and any external attachments of the building resist spread of fire and smoke so far as is reasonably necessary to inhibit the spread of fire within the building, are constructed so that the unseen spread of fire and smoke within concealed spaces is inhibited, and adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls, having regard to the height, use and position of the building. It also states that the assessment takes account of regulations and published design guidance as were current at the time of construction, as well as those which are current at the time of assessment. And that is important. Now, here's the big issue with option B. The confirmation required is surely likely to require the consultant to do much more than which it had agreed to under its appointment, particularly where there is a deleterious materials clause which only applies at the time of specification, which is typical. Therefore, not at the time of construction, and certainly not at the time of assessment. So the consultant would be carrying out additional services inconsistent with the terms of its appointment. Generally, there are similar concerns with option B as with option A. Again, the confirmation must be correct to avoid joint and several liability with the contractor, or risk a potential negligence claim. Also, by selecting option B2, as with option A3, the consultant could be walking into a PI claim by admitting negligent design or services previously carried out. If the consultant provided fire safety services or expertise, or had a monitoring, checking or inspection role, and then concluded using B2 that an adequate standard of safety is not achieved, the consultant would be telling the client or the beneficiary of the form that it has been negligent. Option B2 also requires, as I mentioned, the consultant to identify to the client organisation the remedial and interim measures required. However, what if such remedial and interim measures are not within the scope of the consultant's appointment? What if the consultant hasn't priced for providing remedial and interim measures? Will this be additional services? How is this dealt with under the consultant's appointment? Is it covered under the consultant's appointment? This is not dealt with in Form EWS1 and creates significant uncertainty. And now for the biggest concern. Form EWS1 says nothing about consultant's liability position, save for note 11, which provides that the form is valid up to 5 years from the date at which it was signed. And it's not entirely clear what that means from a legal perspective. The form doesn't link to an underlying appointment, doesn't contain a cap on liability, doesn't contain a no greater or longer lasting liability clause. So liability is unlimited, and for all the reasons discussed, the form is likely to be more onerous on the consultant than its appointment. There is some good news and something positive, I hear you say. Consistent with typical reliance letters or compliance certificates, Form EWS1 does state that reliance of the form is for the sole and exclusive use of the client organisation, and that no responsibility is accepted to any third party for the whole or any part of its contents. Now, whilst this is welcomed and is typical language for, say, a reliance letter, it's certainly not enough to make Form EWS1 acceptable, given all the concerns that I've highlighted so far. So sorry for the complete destruction of Form EWS1. In our view, the form needs to be avoided. The form could increase a consultant's scope, significantly increase a consultant's potential liability, may result in the consultant walking into a professional indemnity insurance claim, and there would be unlimited liability, as I've said. Furthermore, as Ian has noted, there is the possibility that a claim arising out of Form EWS1 is not covered by PI insurance. In my view, and as to be expected, given the analysis, the vast majority of consultants are able to reject Form EWS1 or provide an alternative compliance letter altogether in a more acceptable way. And I can come on to that shortly.
Thanks, Will. I think the message is pretty clear as to sort of what you sort of think about the form, and I have to sort of say, you know, from my point of view, I echo those concerns as well. It's clear things have to improve, and I think this is clearly on the government's radar as well, given their recent November press release. And you'll remember, for those of you who are still with us, that that was something I mentioned earlier. Now, the latest government sort of press release essentially has dealt with the following 3 points. Firstly, they've clarified that they're basically that buildings without cladding are not subject to an EWS1 form. Now, they've estimated that this will benefit approximately 450,000 homeowners. The second point is that they've pledged to fund training for a further 2,000 more building assessors to speed up the process and get more people qualified to sign these EWS1 forms. And then the third point was the point I touched upon earlier regarding the insurance and the fact that they're going to reach out and liaise with the insurance industry to ensure that more professional indemnity insurance is available, not only for the existing assessors, but also presumably for the 2,000 more assessors that they're going to get trained up. And as I said, I've already dealt with the points regarding insurance, so I won't mention it again. But as you've all picked up on this point, sort of, you know, Will's been quite vocal during today's webinar about his views on Form EWS1, and Will and I together have equally been vocal on the same sort of points in previous articles that we've written on the subject. We've sort of already sort of considered and indeed been asked by some clients whether the recent government press release sort of alters our views regarding the risks associated with signing an EWS1 form. In short, we don't think the risks are reduced, and our concerns about EWS1, the Form EWS1 remains. And the reasons for that is that sort of, you know, the announcement that buildings without cladding will now not be subject to an EWS1 form doesn't change anything for buildings that do contain cladding, and you know, these are arguably the high-risk buildings anyway. And you know, the government's pledge to fund training for 2,000 more assessors in itself doesn't reduce the risks we've identified with actually signing the forms. I mean, the risks remain regardless of the number of additional assessors who are qualified to sign them. So I think that's, from my point of view, that was just the final thing to sort of cover, and I'm sort of now going to hand back to Will for some sort of final thoughts on other options and to set out some final conclusions.
Thanks, Ian. So I've been highly critical of Form EWS1. So, you know, what should you do in the alternative if you're unable to reject and avoid giving a compliance letter? The solution is to provide a typical reliance or compliance letter that would be linked to the existing scope of liability under your appointment for the project. which would include drafting, for example, that would say there shall be no greater or longer lasting liability under the letter than in the consultant's underlying appointment. If there's no limit of liability in the appointment, add a standalone limit which is acceptable to your business. Any bespoke reliance or compliance letter should be limited to the consultant exercising reasonable skill and care in fulfilling any of its obligations arising from the form. It should correctly and importantly lay out the scope of the inspections completed by the consultant and when inspections occurred. There should also be explicit exclusions, such as an express exclusion for any responsibility or liability relating to the works the consultant did not install the works. As with Form EWS1, the beneficiary's reliance on the letter should also be closely defined so that third parties cannot rely on it also. Clients and funders are accepting bespoke certificates on this basis, and we have drafted many. So if there is pushback, you should challenge that and push as hard as you can, because, as I say, bespoke forms are being agreed. If the Form EWS1 absolutely has to be entered into, a solution may be to deal with the risks arising in the underlying appointment, such that the underlying appointment trumps Form EWS1. Now, this would require very careful drafting of the appointment, and it's not without risks, but it's nevertheless a possible solution in the circumstances. So having an appointment work in conjunction with Form EWS1. In both circumstances, a compliance letter or the appointment working with Form EWS1, it's important, obviously, to discuss with your legal advisors and also your insurance brokers. So, looking at the time, we're over. We are coming to an end now. I set out on this screen some conclusions in relation to Form EWS1. The important message is that you should avoid it because of the significant risks arising, and that there are other ways of dealing with the confirmation that is required in relation to high-rise buildings, the compliance letter or the appointment working together with Form EWS1. The conclusions set out on this screen are taken from an article that Ian and I had published in Construction Law in August 2020 called Form EWS1, a better solution needs to be found. And our senior partner, Sheena Sood, published an article in Building Magazine in October 2020 on the same subjects, entitled Sign at Your Peril. These articles are on our website, so feel free to go onto our website and access these articles, because they do provide a good summary of the issues in relation to the change in the building regs and also Form EWS1. I don't think, I'm afraid, we've got time as we've run over for questions. As I mentioned, we will circulate questions and answers to all attendees, so that will be with you shortly. And please feel free to email me or Ian direct if you wish. Our contact details will be on the very last slide of this presentation.
And just before we all sort of sign off, I'd just like to take a moment to sort of say, first of all, thank you to everybody for joining this afternoon. It's sort of, obviously we much prefer to be doing these things in sort of person via possibly sort of a round table type discussion, but obviously the time, where we sit at the moment with the pandemic, that's just proved impossible. So just to sort of say again, thank you very much to everybody for joining. I'd also like to take a moment to remind everyone of the upcoming further sort of webinar sessions that we've got as part of Beale Co's construction winter webinar series. On the 25th of November, Beale Co partner James Hutchinson led a session entitled Software as a Service, Consultants as Technology Providers and the Legal Ramifications. This has obviously been and gone, but it's been recorded and it is available to download to watch at your leisure if that is of interest. And if you've missed it, please do get in contact with us. The next live webinar is on the 16th of December, where we've got Beale Co partner James Vernon and senior associate Andrew Croft, and they'll be discussing prolongation and variations in consultants' appointments. Moving into the new year, sort of once we get sort of past Christmas and sort of, well, New Year's Eve, it won't be much of a party this year, but moving into the new year, 13th of January, we've got Beale Co partners Joe Lewis, Nathan Modell and Michael Salau delivering a session entitled Where Will the Golden Thread Lead? The draft building safety bill. And as I say, I made reference to that earlier in the webinar. And last but certainly not least, on the 20th of January 2021, Will returns with associate Robert Reed to discuss the hardening contractual and insurance markets for construction professionals in a session titled Contractual Considerations in 2021, A New Landscape. So it's just to remind you of those sort of sessions. And if you have not registered for them, or if you require any of the recordings, please send an email in to webinars@beale-law.com or marketing@beale-law.com. And so, yeah, just to end again, thank you very much, everybody, and I hope you found that session useful. Here are sort of final sort of contact details for Will and myself. And it remains for me to say, again, thank you for joining myself and Will this afternoon. Stay safe and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.